Next, I am pleased to welcome today's guest speaker, Gillian Tett of the Financial Times. She was recently appointed Provost of King's College, Cambridge. She's going to give us some unique insights on the global trends which will affect all of us, including the insurance sector. Gillian joins us from the UK and will later be joined on stage by Vicky Sapota and Shigeru Ari Izumi. I am sure it will be an insightful discussion. Over to you, Gillian.
Well, thank you very much indeed for that kind introduction. それから皆さんこんばんは。As you've heard, I am now based in London these days, or in England, but previously I was in America, and many years ago I was in Japan, which is a country I love. So I am very sad indeed that I can't be with you in person today. I should also say that I love talking to insurers because as a journalist, I am paid to think about risks in a general sense and to write about the future in a general sense. However, you are an industry that has to put precise numbers on risks and crystallize the risks and the dangers and the trends in the world in very precise ways. So, in some ways, our jobs are symbiotic, but in other ways, you actually are forced to put money on the table to back your ideas and hunches, whereas we just work with words. But having said that, I would like to say that when I look to 2024, what I see are two very obvious risks that are continuing to stalk the world, and then three risks which in some ways are particularly cyclical risks and very striking and harder to price. The first risk, the very obvious one you've just been talking about in detail, is climate change and the way that that's remaking and reordering many of the business strategies for the future and many, frankly, of the contexts which economies are operating and will continue to operate for a long time. The second one, which we're very focused on recently in the UK, is the risk around technology and digitization, the very uncertain trajectory of artificial intelligence and how that's changing how businesses and societies operate, but also, in particular, the issue around cybercrime, cyber hacking, and other types of cyber risks. Just recently, I wrote a column myself about ransomware and the role that the insurance industry does or does not play in ransomware in particular is something that I think in 2024 is going to get more and more attention because the American government is increasingly keen to stop companies paying ransomware and, in particular, to crack down on the insurance industry's role in paying ransoms as we look to the future. So those are two of the tangible risks which in some ways are quite obvious, cyber risk and climate risk, and people at the Financial Times and your industry spend a lot of time trying to measure them. The other three issues which I think will shape 2024 are in some ways less directly related to insurance, but very important for setting the wider climate. One of those three is what I call the reordering of the monetary system, or rather the monetary climate, in the sense that for the last 12 years, or 15 years, we have lived in a period of ultra low interest rates, which have become so pervasive, so deeply embedded, and lasted for such a long time that many people have come to take these almost for granted and have frankly forgotten to put a price on money. This created all manner of dangerous investment booms and bubbles. We've seen many of the consequences of this bubble in the last few months, whether it's the Silicon Valley Bank collapse, whether it's the implosion of WeWork. We've barely started in other arenas, I fear. But the reality is that for the last dozen plus years, the global financial system has been drunk on excess liquidity, and that is now changing. And economists argue furiously about what the new level of so-called R star is, what the natural level of interest rate should be, and whether interest rates will go back down after being hiked so dramatically in the last year. I am personally in the camp of people who thinks that inflation is going to be here for quite a long time and that interest rates are going to stay higher for longer. Either way, the reality is we're seeing a reordering of the monetary policy environment, and I think that's going to shape a lot of the financial sector behavior in 2024, particularly in relation to sovereign debt. The second big issue is that we're also seeing, obviously, a reordering of the geopolitical environment in a particularly tragic way, in the sense that it's creating more protectionism, more conflict, and of course, more outright war. Whenever I talk about war on the geopolitical stage, I'm always very minded of the framework used by Ray Dalio, the founder of Bridgewater, who said that there are 5 different stages of war. And when you use the word war, it's very important to be aware of those 5 stages. Those 5 stages are essentially you can have a trade war, a tech war, a cyber war, a capital war, and a shooting war. By that I mean you can have countries engaged in trade wars, they can be engaged in tech wars in terms of trying to control technology, they can be involved in cybercrime, cyber hacking, they can be involved in all kinds of capital conflict, i.e. stopping each other from investing in the other country or putting controls on capital flows. And then, of course, you get a kinetic shooting war. Now, if you look across the world stage today, you have actual shooting wars in Ukraine, you have shooting wars in the Middle East, you have the risk of shooting wars in many other places too, most dangerously and most terrifyingly between China and the US in the future. Let us hope we never go there. But even before you actually have shooting wars, you have all kinds of other elements of that 5-stage framework around war bubbling up all over the place. And I think that is another theme that is going to shape 2024. This rising geopolitical stress and conflict and the consequences for not just outright protectionism and disruption to supply chains, but potential disruption in other areas around tech and capital flows. The third issue is arising out of that in the West, but not just the West, which is a reordering of the relationship between business and society. In the period starting in the late 1970s to a few years ago, we saw a growing dominance of free market capital ideas and globalization. And there was a sense that free markets were becoming more pervasive, more dominant, spreading around the world, and that movement, that progress, was going in just one direction, i.e. getting deeper and deeper. I never believed what Francis Fukuyama said after the fall of the Berlin Wall, that we were living through the, quotes, end of history. But what I did observe was an assumption amongst many people I spoke to, amongst the global business elite and financial elite, that history was going in one direction, i.e. that we're seeing the spread of more globalization and more free market capitalism around the world. Now, the globalization piece, as I've just said, has been seriously challenged and undermined, if not is going into reverse, because of the outbreak of geopolitical stress and conflict. But I think the free market capitalism idea is also coming under rising attack, because essentially what you're seeing, starting in 2008 with the great financial crisis, is increased intervention by governments in different aspects of the economy and business world. We saw that first with the great financial crisis when Western governments intervened in financial systems to a once unimaginable degree. Then they intervened in the money markets through quantitative easing. Then they intervened during COVID in healthcare systems and other aspects of the economy. And as geopolitical stress rises, you're seeing a growing acceptance of government intervention in the West in all manner of new areas under the banner of national security. Industrial policy is back in vogue, even in countries like America, which was previously seen as a bastion of free market capitalism. Now, maybe that's a temporary swing. Maybe that will go into reverse. I personally doubt it. And I think that one consequence of that in 2024 is that we are going to see a wider reordering of the relationship between business and society. And of course, when you chuck climate change challenges into that mix, along with the digitization and the rapid technological change, that creates further pressure for a reordering of the relationship between business and society. So we live in very volatile, fluid times. They're very frightening times for some people. However, the last point I'll leave you with is that volatile, fluid times are in many ways the norm for humanity if you look back over recent centuries. It was a recent period of seeming ultra-low interest rates, seeming calm, seeming predictability, the idea that history had come to an end, or at least was going in one direction. That was the outlier, not the norm for history. And either way, what all this means is that in 2024, the insurance sector is going to have a lot of risks to price, a lot of customers who will need help in making sense of the future, and a lot of need for your skills and expertise. So, thank you all very much indeed. Once again, I'm very sorry that I can't be with you in person, and I wish you the very best of luck for your conference. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Gillian. This is Shigeru Arizumi from, I'm the chair of the executive committee of IAIS, and thank you very much for joining us. You have been in Japan before, and you know how the natural disasters or climate-related changes are affecting this country and this region. But I thought it might be useful for us to better understand what you might think of the role of insurers or insurance sector will be in the face of challenges like increase in physical risks, but there's also a need for us to make a necessary transition to net zero. So I was kind of wondering if you can elaborate a bit more to shed light on what the insurance sector's role will be in the future.
Well, thank you very much indeed. And as I say, I love Japan. I lived there for many years. I have 2 points to make. The first is that the insurance sector has a critically important role in terms of trying to price difficult to price risks, looking at the climate issues in the future. And the reason I say that is because at the moment, the climate issue is very politicized in many countries, particularly America. And there's a lot of vague rhetoric and angry political fighting occurring, which often takes dominance and distracts people from the underlying reality. The critically important social role of insurance today is that you look at these risks without politics. You just try and judge the likelihood of events happening or not, and you try and prepare for them. You look at the science because you have to. There is money on the line. And so I would beseech all of the insurance groups in the room and in your association to speak up and speak out clearly based on the science and your modeling of the risks in a non-political way. Because there's almost nobody else today on the world stage who can do that, and who can actually have the credibility, not just in the financial markets and business, but also in the society as a whole. So my first point is that you have a more important role than ever to talk directly, openly about the numbers that you're seeing without a political angle. Secondly, the question of who is going to bear the losses of climate issues is really important and needs to be clarified and discussed in public. Because if you look at a country like America, there is an assumption that the ultimate loss bearer will be the government. So insurance companies, private sector insurance companies, are presumed to be taking some of the risks, but there is this very dangerous assumption that if risks are too big to be borne by the private sector, the government will step in and provide insurance of last resort. Now, it has never been clarified the degree to which that is actually happening and how those losses will be shared in the future. The FEMA group is the ultimate example of that uncertainty and the dangerous policy implications from it. Because the presence of FEMA as a federal body in America, which is presumed to scoop up the risks which are uninsurable and protect the population in the last resort from climate shocks, the presence of that insurance, that backstop, in an ambiguous fashion, means that homes have continued to be built in America in really, really stupid places. I mean, all along the American coasts, there are building developments which make absolutely no sense if you look at the climate projections for the future. And yet people continue to build because they somehow assume that the federal government will be a backstop to protect them in the future. Essentially, you're using taxpayers' money to subsidize rich people's houses. And the question of the role of FEMA in America and the federal insurance backstop is going to become more and more critical as climate change issues become worse. So a failure to clarify who exactly is going to be on the hook in the last resort for losses is creating some really bad policies and not just wasting money, but setting up countries and societies in the future for big, big problems. Now, different countries have different approaches to risk sharing and to sharing pain. One of the things that I think is deeply admirable in Japan is that there is a very strongly held tradition of sharing pain across society in an equal way. When I was working in Japan during the Japanese financial crisis, I remember going to see the CEO of a big company who joked to me and said, in Japan, if we have to cut 20% of our wage bill, we cut everybody's salary by 20%, and maybe the CEO cuts their salary by 30%. In England, you're more likely to cut 20% of the workforce, and in America, you're more likely to cut 40% of the workforce and pay the CEO 20% more. There is, in a very positive way, Japan has a strong tradition of sharing pain and sharing risks, and that's very admirable. But the question of who is going to bear the risks that are hard to insure and how are you going to divide that between the public and private sector, that really needs to be clarified going forward.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Vicky, would you like to?
Hi, Gillian. A very interesting. My name is Vicky Saporta, and I'm the outgoing chair of the IAIS. And in my day job, I'm a central banker at the Bank of England. So I was interested, and I did read your article on cyber and your experience in San Francisco. I was wondering, I mean, clearly insurance always involves an element of moral hazard. I mean, it's embedded in any insurance contract. That is true, of course, for cyber insurance as well, in terms of moral hazard. So what is the sort of course, you quote statistics in your article that cyber attackers focus more on companies that do have the cyber insurance, because then they know they're going to be paid out. So it's a rational thing, and the stats back it. But what is the answer to that? How do you resolve the moral hazard problem?
Well, there is a tremendous problem of, collective action here, in that basically, unless everybody agrees not to pay insurance, not to pay ransoms, it's very tempting always for some companies to pay ransoms to solve the problem quickly. And frankly, the only answer that I can see is for governments to ban insurance companies from covering ransom payments, and potentially to ban companies from paying ransoms under the money laundering rules. Now, the American government is certainly thinking about that. There has been debate around whether it can use the money laundering rules. But if the governments were to actually ban ransom payments, that would mark another level of intrusion by government into private sector decision-making and company decision-making. That would again be a big break from the past 40 years, when it has been presumed that companies had the right to set their own strategies. I think that has to be seen within a wider context of a reordering of the relationship between business and society, and also a growing recognition of cyber risk. Because the reality is that as cyber attacks increase, it's raising really big questions about corporate governance in the widest possible sense in America. And it's worth remembering that about 20 years ago, when the American government, the White House, first started talking about trying to take measures around cybercrime and cyber risks, the American Chamber of Commerce strongly resisted the idea that the White House or federal agencies would be able to interfere with companies' operations on the basis that that was going to be an unacceptable breach of corporate governance. And they actually refused to work for a while with White House around trying to tackle cybercrime or report cyber breaches. Now that's changed dramatically. Today, the Chamber of Commerce is working strongly with other federal agencies to try and tackle cyber risk. But the really big question that is being considered behind the scenes right now is there going to be a case in the future for the government to mandate which suppliers companies can use in relation to cyber services to prevent the kind of cyber hacking you're seeing right now in the supplier chain or the service provision for companies, and prevent this constant risk that some of the weakest links in the chain of corporate activity end up infecting and creating cyber disasters right across the ecosystem. And, there's a really interesting tension between the rights of companies to innovate constantly and choose their own suppliers and choose the most efficient solutions for their company needs, say in the area of cloud, versus the need to try and make those choices the most secure and defensible against cyber attacks as possible. So there's a real issue here between collective good and individual choice and corporate governance. And at the moment, the White House is basically just asking investors to think about these issues when they're talking to corporate boards. It's entirely possible that if global conflict keeps rising and we see really bad cyber attacks on different Western nations, that the pressure to act will increase. So to come back to your point about ransomware or other areas of cyber risk, I think at the moment there's still a presumption that companies should have corporate governance based on individual choice. I'm not necessarily sure that that will continue in the future.
Thank you very much, Gillian. That has been brilliant. Thanks very much. Thank you.
Thank you very
Thank
much
you.
for joining us. It has been a pleasure, and I hope the audience can have a round of applause for Gillian Tett. Thank you very much.